The twin suns of the trade planet burned in the sky as Rick Maddox walked through the dusty market stalls. Noise filled the air with aliens shouting and machines humming and strange smells floating everywhere. Rick was not here to buy food or trinkets or company. He needed spare parts for his ship and nothing more. He passed by cages made of glowing bars and looked away from the miserable eyes inside, but then something tugged at his boot. A small hand, thin and trembling, reached out from one of the metal cages. He turned slowly and saw her, an alien girl no taller than his waist, with golden skin and glowing violet eyes. Chains hung from her wrists and ankles, but her posture was straight. She was not crying or begging like the others. She simply looked up at him and whispered, "I want you to be my master." Rick froze in place and stared at her. Merchant beside the cage laughed and slapped the bars with a long stick. "This one is broken in the head," he said. "She asks for a master instead of crying for her mother, probably not even worth half a bolt." Rick did not speak. He knelt in front of the cage and looked closer. She had marks around her neck from an old collar. Faint scars ran down her arms, and one of her fingers was bent at a wrong angle. But her eyes, they were not dead. They were burning with something else. "What's your name?" Rick asked softly. The girl tilted her head and blinked. "Slowly, name," she said. "Object 17. That's what I was given." Rick stood and pulled out a small chip. "How much?" he asked. The merchant shrugged and named a cheap price. Rick paid it without another word. A few nearby aliens watched in confusion. Humans rarely bought slaves, and if they did, it was never with such care. The cage hissed open and the chains clicked as Rick stepped forward. The girl crawled out slowly and knelt on the ground in front of him. She lowered her head and said again, "I will obey, master." Rick looked down and leaned close to her ear. His voice was low but clear. "You're not our property." She looked up sharply, her eyes wide with confusion. But she did not speak. Rick gently lifted her to her feet and led her through the market streets. People stared, but no one stopped them. Inside Rick's old freighter, she stood silently near the entrance, unsure if she should sit or move. Rick pointed to a chair and said softly, "You can sit there." She hesitated, then slowly sat down, curling her legs under herself like she had been trained. Rick brought her clean water and a protein bar. She stared at the food, then sniffed it before taking the tiniest bite. "What do I call you?" Rick asked as he checked the controls of the ship. She looked puzzled again. "Call, I told you. I'm Object 17. "That's not a name," Rick said. "It's a number." She blinked, then looked down at her hands. "I don't know another name," she said quietly. "Then you get to pick one," Rick said. She looked surprised. "I can pick anything you want," Rick said. She thought for a long moment and finally said curry. Rick smiled and nodded. "Curry it is." That night, Rick gave her a small room beside the engine bay. It had a soft bed and a clean blanket. She sat on the bed like she didn't know what to do with it. Rick said goodnight and left the door slightly open in case she needed anything. But later that night, Rick woke up to soft sounds. He walked to her room and saw Kari shaking in her sleep, her face twisted in fear. She was speaking in a strange alien language, and her hands clutched the blanket tightly. Rick gently touched her shoulder, and she gasped. Awake, her eyes wide with panic, she saw him and quickly dropped her eyes. "I am sorry, master," she whispered. Rick shook his head and said again, "You're not a property. You're free now." She did not answer. She just looked at him with the same burning eyes as if she wanted to believe him, but couldn't. Not yet. Rick knew then that freeing her body was only the first step. Freeing her mind would take time, and he would stay beside her every step of the way, because Kari was not an object. She was someone worth saving. The engines of the freighter hummed low as Rick adjusted the flight controls and checked their path through the outer rim zone. Kari sat quietly behind him on the metal bench, watching his hands move over the panel with silent interest. She held a small blanket in her lap, the same one he gave her last night, and still wore the simple tunic he had laid out for her, clean and warm. Yet she sat with her back straight, her hands resting carefully like she waited for orders. Rick turned to her with a tired smile and said, "We are out of the trade planet's range. No one can chase us here now." Kari only nodded and kept her eyes on his boots, not daring to look at his face. "You can speak if you want," Rick added, his voice gentle. "You are Safe here, no one will punish you. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Rick stood up, stretched his arms, and waved her over to the supply shelf. There are some things here for you, he said. Kari followed slowly, her eyes scanning every corner of the room like she was stepping into dangerous ground. Rick opened a drawer full of small items and tools, some old datapads, chip tablets, pencils, wires. Pick anything you want to keep for yourself, he said again. She looked at the pile with confusion. I do not need anything, Master, she whispered. Stop calling me Master, Rick replied softly, his voice firm. This isn't a command post. I am not your owner. She looked down at her feet, unsure how to respond. Rick picked up a small smooth stone from the shelf and handed it to her. Keep this then. She took the stone and studied it closely, feeling its warmth in her palm. Why would I need this? She asked quietly. Because you chose it, Rick said. That's what matters. Kari sat at the corner of the engine room later, tracing lines on the floor with the edge of the stone she had taken. Rick brought her a tray of food and set it beside her, then sat down a few feet away. You really never had a name before, he asked. She shook her head slowly. In the compound we were given numbers. Names were forbidden. Names meant identity. Identity meant rebellion. Rick rubbed his chin, thinking for a moment. So when you said Kari yesterday, was that a real name from your Pia? Kari blinked a few times, then nodded slowly. I think it is, she said. I do not know how I know, but it feels like a real name, like something once whispered into my ears long ago. Maybe by my mother, maybe in a dream. Rick smiled again. Then as your name, and we'll never call you Object 17. Again she looked up at him for the first time since they left the market, her eyes soft and filled with quiet confusion. You speak to me like I am equal, she said. Because you are. She seemed to think about that sentence for a long time. When Rick returned to the cockpit, Kari remained behind in the room and began arranging small things in a corner, making a place that felt like hers. She picked up wires, not to fix anything but to braid them into patterns she did not understand, yet her fingers remembered them. She held the stone to her forehead and whispered Kari softly under her breath again and again. Later, Rick showed her how the ship worked, explaining the fuel lines, the control systems, the emergency routines. She watched everything closely, learning like a sponge soaking water. He gave her a small toolkit and told her to practice unscrewing and attaching old panels. Kari worked with care and steady focus, never breaking anything, never asking for praise. At night, Rick found her curled up in the engine room again, not on the bed, but beside the warm pipe. You can use the bed, you know, he said gently. She shook her head softly. It is too soft, she replied. Rick sat beside her and asked, did you have friends? Before she stared into the pipe's glow before answering. I remember a boy with white eyes and silver hair. He used to pass me food when guards were not watching. What happened to him? They took him after he cried out during a memory scan. I never saw him again. Rick felt a tight knot in his chest and said nothing for a long while. You don't have to talk about the past, he said. Finally, Kari nodded, but then added, I want to learn how to talk. Rick tilted his head. Talk like you do, she said. I want to use the right words. I want to say what I feel, not just what I am told to say. Rick stood and went to his locker, returning with an old, dusty tablet. It as a language book, he said. It teaches speech and tone and expression in simple words. He handed it to her and she hugged it tightly as if it were treasure. Thank you, she whispered. He smiled again and walked back toward his bunkery. Opened the first page, slowly tracing each symbol with her fingers and reading them out loud in whispers. Voice was shaking but strong. In that quiet night on a lonely ship, a girl who was once only a number began to remember who she was, not a tool, not a slave, but Kari. The stars outside moved slowly as the freighter drifted through quiet space. A soft hum filled the halls while Kari sat cross-legged near the engine reading from the language tablet Rick had given her. She repeated words in a whisper, her voice rising and falling like waves, trying to understand emotion, tone, meaning. Rick stood near the cockpit watching her from a distance, proud of how far she had come in just a few days. She now spoke in short sentences. She asked questions. She even laughed once when a wrench fell on Rick's foot. But peace does not last forever. not in a galaxy where freedom is rare. Rick was adjusting the outer sensor array when something flickered on the screen. A signal, encrypted, old format, but still readable. It was a bounty code, not for a criminal, not for a thief, but for a missing slave designation. Object 17, alive, unknown vessel, reward double for return. Rick stared at the screen in silence, his breath slowing. They were looking for her, and they were offering a Lothy shut the screen quickly and walked to the back. Kari was braiding wires into circles like bracelets. She looked up and smiled softly, trying her best to form the sentence, "I like doing this." Rick forced a small smile and nodded. "We have to talk," he said. She tilted her head, the smile fading. "Someone sent out a bounty," Rick said, slow and clear. It's about Yao." Kari went still, the wires falling from her hands. "They know I am gone," she whispered. "They will come for me." Rick sat beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I will not let them take you." But she looked down, and her voice was hollow. "They will take me or kill you, or both." Rick stood and walked to the storage bay. He opened a locked crate and pulled out a small blaster and an old shield. "Generator, we can fight," he said. Kari followed him into the training room, a small open space near the back of the ship. Handed her a training stick, light and safe. "Show me what they taught." Kari held the stick in a tight grip, her stance low and fast. Rick stepped forward with caution and moved slowly in a basic guard. Kari struck once, twice, 3 times, fast like lightning. Rick blocked the first 2, but the third hit his shoulder. She dropped the stick quickly. "I'm sorry," Rick laughed softly. "No need to say sorry. That was impressive." She blinked, confused by the praise. "You were fast," he said. "You learned this as a slave." She nodded. "I was trained to fight only when ordered and only to protect higher command, never for myself." Rick walked to the wall and pulled down a map of the outer systems. "There is a rebel station here," he said. "If we make it, they might help us understand what they did to you." Kari hesitated, then asked softly, "Will they want to use me?" Rick looked into her eyes and said, "I will not let anyone use you ever again." As they prepared the ship for travel, Kari felt something sharp behind her ear, a burning spot. She touched it gently and flinched. Rick saw the mark and examined it closely. It was a hidden scar, a small embedded chip deep under the skin. A tracker, old tech, but still active. "No wonder they found us," Rick said. "We have to remove it." Kari sat down in the medical chair and closed her eyes. Rick used a scanner to locate the chip, then a small tool to pull it free. It came out with a soft beep and a tiny flash of blue light. Rick crushed it under his boot. "Now they cannot follow us." But he was wrong. In the dark edge of space, a bounty ship locked onto their last known signal and followed fast inside their cockpit. A voice spoke. "Target acquired. Object 17, prepare retrieval." Back on the freighter, Rick and Kari sat near the meal station sharing food. She looked at the crushed tracker on the table and said, "Even when I thought I was free, they still had me not anymore." Rick said, "Now you are truly invisibly." Kari nodded and touched her bracelet of wires, the first thing she made on her own. "I want to make more," she said, "for others like me." Rick looked at her with a small smile. "You will," but a sharp beep rang through the ship. "Alert, incoming vessel." Rick ran to the cockpit and saw it on the scanner. One ship, fast armed. He turned to Kari and said, "Get ready, we are not alone anymore." She nodded and stood tall. For the first time in her life, she was not afraid to fight back. Enemy ship moved fast, shadows streaking across the stars as Rick pulled hard on the control stick, spinning the freighter out of target range. The engines roared loud and hot while Kari held tight to the wall, watching the lights flicker. They were not ready for battle, but they had no choice. Rick shouted from the cockpit, "Grab the manual turret and hold it steady. If they breach, we run to the lower deck." Ari ran down the hall, heart pounding, her feet light as feathers. She had trained for pain. She had trained to protect others, but this was different. This was survival. She jumped into the gun seat, hands shaking, gripping the controls. With wide eyes outside the window, the bounty ship grew closer, weapons glowing, ready to fire. Rick launched a flare and changed direction fast. The sudden shift made Kari's seat rattle. She aimed the turret, just like he showed her, and pulled the trigger. The blast hit the enemy's side, not enough to destroy, but enough to force them to swerve. Rick yelled, Into the intercom, good shot. Keep hitting the side panels. But the bounty ship fired back a sharp pulse that hit the freighter's hull, causing sparks to flick. Kari kept firing one shot after another, her fear fading with each strike. Suddenly the enemy ship pulled away, smoke trailing from its wing, and within seconds it jumped to hyperspace, leaving them alone in the dark. Skyrick breathed out slowly, then called out. Karish came running, her face full of worry and sweat. You did great, he said. You saved you. Oskari looked at her hands, then at him, and whispered, I never fought for myself before. Rick nodded. Well, now you have. Later, Kari sat alone in her small room, holding the stone Rick gave her on the first day. It felt different now, not just warm, but alive. Her skin tingled, and her mind swirled with strange memories. Things she could not fully see, voices she could not understand. She stood and walked to the mirror, pulling down the collar of her shirt, revealing the faint lines on her neck. The marks from the slave collar were glowing soft red like embers hidden under the skin. Rick saw it as he passed by the open door and stepped inside. That's not normal, he said. Kari turned around, her eyes wide. It started burning after the fight, she said. Rick scanned it using a small tool. The readings were strange, high-energy ancient code. This isn't just a collar mark, he said. It's a neural lock, and it's still active. Kari's hands trembled. Then I thought it was gone. Rick shook his head. They didn't just chain your body. They tried to lock your power, your thoughts, your will. Kari backed away from the mirror and sat on the bed, hugging her knees. Is it still controlling me? She asked. Rick crouched beside her. No, not anymore. It's fading. But it might be the reason your memories are hidden, your energy still limited. Kari looked down, breathing slow, then said, Can we remove it completely? Rick nodded. We'll find a way. He contacted an old friend, a rebel tech named Sella, who knew Forbidden's systems and mind tech. Sella agreed to meet at a moon base 2 jumps away, but warned the process would not be easy. The next day, Rick and Kari left the outer zone and traveled to the moon base, a small cold station with old walls and dim lights. Sella greeted them with a raised brow and a dry laugh. You always bring me trouble. Rick smiled and said, This is Kari. She needs help. Sella looked at Kari and her face turned serious at once. She's a Velari, isn't she? Kari stepped back, confused. What is Velari? She asked. Sella pointed at her glowing neck and whispered, The Velari were a rare race, powerful with energy light, and thought they could shape heat, control metal, speak without sound. They were nearly wiped out during the purga. Kari's eyes filled with tears. I don't remember any of that. Sella placed a hand on her shoulder and said, That's what the collar was made to do. Block your past, seal your nature, make you forget. We'll unlock it, Rick said. Sella led Kari into a small chamber with scanners and light beams. This will hurt, she warned. Kari only nodded, ready. The chamber filled with soft hums, and then sharp light beams touched Kari's skin. Her eyes shut tight, her hands clenched. Images flashed in her mind, a world of silver trees, sky like crystal, a tall woman with golden hair calling her Namakara Karasidli. The light burst, the collar mark faded, and smoke rose from her skin. Sella turned off the machine and caught her before she fell. It's done, she said. She's free. Rick stepped forward as Kari opened her eyes, glowing bright-eyed. Remember now, she whispered. I remember who I was, not a tool, not a number, but Kari of the Velari. The stars blinked in the black sky as the freighter soared through the silent void, heading toward a rebel station hidden behind an asteroid belt. Rick adjusted the course while Kari stood near the window, her eyes glowing softly, her mind filled with memories that were once locked away. She remembered her home, a planet of light and energy, her people, the Velari, who sang to the stars and shaped metal like clay. She remembered the day fire fell from the sky, ships of iron and chains descended. They called it purification, but it was slaughter. She had survived only because she was small, silent, forgotten, locked in a cold room by a caretaker who never returned. Rick entered the room and saw her standing still, her hand pressed to the glass, as if reaching for something that was no longer there. Are you okay? He asked. Kari turned slowly, her voice calm but deep with weight. I know who I am now, and I know why they fear me. Rick nodded and said, That means we need to be even more careful. He handed her a small device, a beacon stone carved with rebel code. Take this if we get separated. Send the signal, and I will find Yaukari. Held it tight, then said they will never stop hunting me. Then we make sure they fail, Rick replied as they neared. The station scanners picked up 3 ships behind them, fast-moving, closing in. Rick cursed under his breath and pulled the freighter into the nearest cloud of space. Dust engines humming loud, and Yaukari closed her eyes and reached out with her mind. Something new, something strange. She could feel the ships, feel their heat, their weight, their hate. She pointed left without opening her eyes. They are flanking from starboard side. Rick turned hard, the ship shaking as lasers flew past. Curry ran to the side turret and fired back, her aim sharper than before, guided by instinct, not training. One ship exploded in a flash of blue flame. The others backed off, but only for a moment. Rick set the course to the rebel station and activated the emergency code. A beacon of orange light flashed from the hull. The station answered with a pulse of green and opened a hidden gate in the asteroid field. Rick flew in fast, barely dodging the spinning rocks as the remaining enemies tried to follow the rebels. Fired back from the station's cannons, forcing the enemy ships to scatter and vanish into the black inside the station. Rick and Curry were taken to a secure chamber, guarded by soldiers with heavy armor and sharp eyes. A woman named Commander Ellen greeted them with suspicion, but listened as Rick explained everything. When Curry stepped forward and lifted her hand, showing the fading collar mark and glowing eyes, Ellen paused, then whispered, Valerie, you are supposed to be gone. I was hidden, Curry said, then taken. Ellen called her tech team and had Carrie scanned from head to toe. They confirmed her energy levels were off the charts. Living weapon, one of them said. Rick stepped forward sharply. She is not a weapon. Ellen raised a hand. Calm your words. Human, I do not see a weapon. I see a chance. Akari was led to a chamber filled with other rescued beings. Some broken, some healing, some young, some old. They looked at her with wide eyes as if sensing something ancient. One small girl reached for her hand and Kari knelt, giving her the stone Rick had once given her. You are not a slave, she told the girl. You are a name waiting to be spoken later. Ellen returned with a proposal. The rebels were planning a strike against a syndicate facility that held dozens of enslaved Valari. They wanted Kari's help to disable the mind locks from a distance. Using her unique gift, Kari agreed without hesitation, but on one condition. No killing, she said. We are not them. Rick smiled, proud of her strength and her heart. Together they flew to the edge of the syndicate space. Kari focused her mind, sending waves of light and thought into the compound inside. The prisoners began to stir collars, dimming one by one. Alarms rang out, but the rebels stormed the base fast and quiet, rescuing everyone without a single life taken back on the ship. Kari sat holding the hands of those now free, whispering names to them, names she felt in her soul, names lost to time. Rick stood nearby, watching her with quiet wonder. She had once been a girl in chains. Now she was a light across the stars, a voice for the voiceless. And yet, despite all the power she had gained, she never once called herself a queen or a leader, only carrion. She had one promise left to keep. Asterisk. The ship floated quietly above the clouds of a small moon below. The surface old ruins of the Valari shimmered in the moonlight, covered in vines and crystal growths. Untouched for many years, Kari stood at the edge of the ramp, staring down at the glowing ground, her heart pulling her forward. Rick stood behind her, arms crossed, scanning the ruins from the ship's display. Something here feels familiar, he said. Kari nodded. This was once a temple, she said. Before the fall, it was a place of voice and peace. Rick looked at her. You remember it? Kari took a slow breath. I remember the songs and the lights. I remember walking here as a child, holding someone's hand, maybe my sister, maybe my guardian. I don't know yet. But I feel them. They stepped out together, walking toward the broken structure, the air humming with quiet power inside. The walls were carved with symbols, flowing lines, glowing faint blue. Kari traced them with her fingers, and her energy lit the symbols brighter. The whole room began to pulse with gentle waves of light. She stepped into the center and sat down, legs folded, eyes closed, her mind reaching outward, touching the memories hidden in the stone. Rick waited by the door, watching as the light swirled around her. Kari's Voice rose soft and musical in a language Rick could not understand yet. It moved something in him, something ancient and powerful. The room responded, the floor rising, the walls shifting. And from the center of the chamber, a crystal grew tall and shining. It was a memory core, a Velari beacon meant to awaken lost ones. Kari placed her hand upon it, and the room filled with amazed Velari. Dancing in the air, children learning to shape metal with light, elders singing to the stars. Then came the ships. Fire chains, screaming machines, and silence. Kari gasped and pulled back, tears in her eyes. They took everything, she whispered, but they could not take the soul. Rick stepped forward gently. You don't have to carry it all alone. Kari turned to him, her voice steady. I am not alone. I have you, and now I have my people. They left the temple with the beacon now active, sending a signal to any remaining Velari across space. Back on the ship, Kari opened a panel near the engine bay and began building something new, something alive. It was not a weapon, not a shield, but a song box made of light wires and memory crystals. She worked for hours, her hands moving fast, guided by feeling, not instruction. Rick brought her food and water, but she barely noticed her focus, unshaken. When it was done, she placed it in the center of the room and touched it once. The song began. It was soft and bright and full of hope. It played the voice of the Velari, not of war, but of healing. Rick sat beside her and listened, eyes closed, letting the music wash over him. This is what they feared, Kari said, not our power, but our peace. The next day, messages began arriving. Velari survivors scattered across the galaxy had heard the beacon. They were coming home. One by one, ships began to land near the temple. Some were small pods, some were old freighters, some barely flew at all, but they came. Kari met each one at the landing site, holding out her hands, helping them down, whispering names to them. Like gifts, Rick watched the moon slowly turn into a sanctuary. Velari children ran through the fields, laughter returning to a place once drowned in silence. A council formed, not of rulers but of guardians, and they chose Kari as their guide. She stood before them, not in robes or armor, but in her old tunic, still carrying the first stone Rick had given Harry. And not your queen, she said. I am your sister and your voice, and your reminder that even in darkness we carry the light. Rick smiled as the crowd echoed her words with glowing palms lifted high, but not all were pleased. From the shadows of the galaxy, the Syndicate watched the rebirth with cold fury. They sent messages to Rick, offers to buy information, threats to make him disappear. He ignored them. Kari warned her people, and they prepared not for war, but for protection. They trained with energy in mind, but also with kindness, teaching the lost, teaching the afraid, reminding each soul of its worth. Kari stood at the edge of the hill one night, looking up at the stars. Rick joined her and asked, what are you thinking? She smiled softly. That I was once a tool, then a ghost. Now I am a fire that will never go out. Rick placed a hand on her shoulder and said, the galaxy is better because of you. She looked at him, eyes full of light, and said, no, it is better because you believed I could be more. The stars glowed quietly above the silver moon as a soft wind moved across the fields. The old temple now stood tall again, its broken walls repaired, its light shining through the sky. Kari walked slowly down the path, her long scarf fluttering behind her, her face calm, her step steady. She passed by children training with small stones floating in their hands, their minds focused, their eyes full of wonder. She smiled and nodded to each of them, watching as they formed shapes in the air, not to fight but to express. Rick waited near the edge of the field, adjusting the antenna on the top of the freighter. Still scratched, still loud, still flying like it always had. Kari joined him and looked at the sky. A message had arrived early that morning, a final threat from the Syndicate. They were sending a fleet, no more bounty, no more offers, only destruction. They want to erase us again, she said. Rick looked at her and asked, what are we going to do? Kari held the songbox in her hands, its crystal glowing faint blue, and said, we are not going to run, and we are not going to fight them like they expect. We will show them who we areas. The Syndicate ships entered the system. A wave of fear passed through the young Velari, many still healing, many still unsure, but Kari stood at the front, her arms raised, her voice clear and warm. We are not slaves. We are not weapons, we are not afraid, she sent out the song again across the system, the same melody that had awakened the lost now reaching the cold steel hearts of those who came with fire inside the lead syndicate ship. The commander paused as the music filled the command deck. It was not coded, it was not a threat. It was just a voice, soft and ancient, calling them to remember. Some ignored it, some grew angry, some stopped completely, their weapons offline, their hands shaking. Kari stepped forward on a high platform, her body glowing with soft energy, her eyes meeting the incoming ships without fear. Rick stood beside her, his own hands empty, but his presence strong. The first ship fired a warning blast. It struck the shield, but caused no harm. Kari raised both hands, not to strike, but to open a vision, a large image of her people, dancing, singing, healing. This is who we are, she said. Not what you made us. The fleet paused, ships hanging silent above the moon. Then one by one, they turned away, leaving the system vanishing into the black, as if they never existed. Valari cheered not for victory, but for peace. Later that evening, Kari sat beside a small campfire near the temple. The children played music nearby. Rick brought 2 cups of warm root drink and handed one to her. She took it with a smile and said, "I thought I would feel more anger." Rick nodded, but said, "You chose healing over hate. That takes more strength." Kari looked at the sky and whispered, "We are free, now truly free." Leaned back and asked, "What will you do now?" She was quiet for a long time, then said, "I will stay for a while and teach. Then I will travel, find more like us, help them remember, like I remembered." Rick looked at her, unsure whether to ask the next question, but did anyway. "Will you come back?" Kari turned and smiled, not the smile of a scared girl, not the smile of someone needing rescue, but the smile of someone whole, someone complete. "Always," she said. "This place, this crew, this path, it changed everything." She reached into her pouch and pulled out the old stone, the one he had given her in the first days. "This was the first thing I chose," she said, and it was the beginning of everything. Rick held it for a moment, then gave it back. "You made it mean something." Kari stood and looked at the freighter, its lights flickering, its hull worn. "I think it is time for me to have my own ship," she said with a grin. Rick laughed softly and said, "Already leaving me behind?" She shook her head, "Never leaving, only flying farther." A week later they stood on the landing pad, her new ship, small and bright, made from parts gifted by the Valari, crafted by her own hands with help from Rick. She wore a light cloak and a simple belt with tools and crystals, not a weapon in sight. Rick extended his hand and she took it, then pulled him into a hug, one arm tight around his shoulder. "You never owned me," she whispered, "but you gave me everything." He whispered back, "And you were never mine, but you made me better." Kari stepped into her ship, the door closed, the engines hummed, a soft blue flame lifted her gently into the sky. Children waved, the elders sang, the temple lights glowed bright as she soared into the stars, no longer a number, no longer an object, not a slave, not a master, only Kari, the free one, and her story was just beginning.